Chapter 2. Sounds of gunfire. The guardhouse. Dead dreadlocks. A man and a woman. A drunk. Cade. Found there dead. A long walk. 1997. Out in the black, the flashlights hung like busted stars, and the old night stitched shut over itself, and in that suture sorrow took root, burning low and steady like the coals of a dead fire. Sacrifice was a morning shift now, and death no more than a dog curled up on the stoop, waiting. Survival was a twitch in the muscle, an old nerve too stubborn to quit. Jinx moved through it like a ghost caught between worlds, and when he lifted the pistol and cracked the silence with its bark, it was no rebellion, it was ritual. Talon and Freedom crept low through the wreckage like two shapes carved out of the night itself. The world around them held no breath and no pulse, only the dry crackle of ash beneath their boots. Freedom's breath came slow and measured, like a prayer she had been made to repeat since childhood, and Talon walked with the darkness stitched to his back, an old coat worn thin but never discarded. They slipped into place behind the gutted bones of a wall, with weapons loose in hand and eyes cold and waiting, two last stars refusing to gutter out. Bud moved first, a chunk of flesh pressed into the broken earth, and Cade followed him like a tethered dog, and the doorway slouched open before them, busted and splintered, like some ancient mouth that had long forgotten how to speak. The stink inside was thick with mold and old sweat. Bud's fingers brushed the bag at his hip, and the Remington slept inside it like an old sin, and Cade's boots kicked loose the debris, and Bud didn't spare him a glance. The gunshot cracked the void clean down its middle, and all heads turned to hear it. Flashlights knived through the dark in mad sweeps, wild and sightless, and voices barked in broken tongues, and weapons rose from the rubble like old bones summoned to war. But none of it mattered. The thing had already been set loose, stitched into the skin of the night, long before any of them had drawn breath. Far off behind them somewhere, the dark moved different, as if it were alive and breathing, and Jinx faded back into nothing, swallowed by the same darkness that had once made him pray to survive, that now carried him like an old friend. And the dreadlocks chased the sound like moths to an invisible flame. The shift in energy was a slow ripple that Bud felt under his boots. Cade's nerves couldn't catch up. They moved like two shadows in a sea of other louder ones, slipping through the busted-out doorway. The building sighed as they entered. An old wood and rusted steel ached under the weight of their intrusion, and somewhere upstairs a radio crackled with static and broken laughter. Talon and Freedom became silhouettes against the chaos, pressed low behind a slab of shattered wall, with their eyes gleaming cold in the flickering light. Freedom's hand rested near the hilt of her blade, calm and patient, while Talon was a lion watching an injured gazelle as he stared at the back of the guardhouse. The guardhouse was a carcass stitched from the bones of dead machines and the scraps of better men's hopes. It leaned into the dirt, sagging beneath its own ruin. Rust and tarpaulin and cracked aluminum patched its sides, and it was held together with wire and prayer. A lantern swung from a bent hook above the door, and it coughed light into the dark, and the shadows were writhing like dying insects against the walls. The door was no door, just a sheet of metal, screaming in the wind. And the stink inside was heavy with mold and old sweat, thick enough to chew. It was no stronghold. It was a grave built by men too stubborn to lie down. The first pair stumbled out into the open, yelling blind into the dark. Talon gave the smallest nod, and his fingers brushed Freedom's wrist like the wing beat of some dark bird. And then they split, sudden and sure, scattering like shards of broken glass. The first guard had his lantern swinging dumb in his hand, and barely had time to lift his eyes. Freedom's knife slid up between jaw and ear, and his breath caught and sputtered, and then it was leaking out of him in wet gasps. And she laid him down easy as a mother would a sleeping child, the blood pooling under him in a slow red river that forgot how to run. Across the courtyard, the second guard lumbered into the open, and Talon moved to meet him with his club hanging loose in his hand like a forgotten thought. The weapon was a savage thing, wrapped in black leather, scarred and pitted, and crowned with a metal head that remembered every man it had killed. The lantern light caught the jagged edges of it, which glinted red like the eyes of some patient beast. "Easy now," Talon said, low enough it might have been a prayer. The guard turned, but too slow, and Talon swung, and the club sank into the side of his skull with a sound like wet wood snapping. The guard sagged, but stood, mouth open, breathing still, and Callan stepped in close, so close he could smell the fear peeling off him, and he whispered, "Go ask the dark." And he shoved him down into the dirt, and when the man hit the ground, he raised the club again and brought it down hard, and the skull flattened under the blow, splitting like ripe fruit, the earth drinking deep of what spilled. Talon dragged the club down the dead man's back and wiped it clean of brains and blood, his face cut from stone. Freedom stood over the bodies, her breath thin and sharp, and her eyes combing the dark like it might break apart and birth something worse. Her hair hung in wet strands across her brow, but her eyes stayed hard and steady as iron sights. "Two down," she said. Voice low and stripped of anything like hope, she glanced toward the far side of the camp where the rest of the dreadlocks milled about in drunken confusion, slow to catch the scent of their own blood. "How many more you think before they figure it?" Talon grunted and crouched down low, and he began tracing his fingers across the edge of his club. "Don't matter. They won't have time to think. Keep it clean. Keep it quick." Talon's gaze slipped to the building squatting at the heart of the camp, the light bleeding out of it like a wound that wouldn't close. A lure if there ever was one. He jerked his chin at it, and Freedom nodded. "We'll be in and out before they even know," she said, her voice a thread of certainty, but with something more hidden than the undercurrent. Jinx adjusted his jacket, then hugged himself, his MAC-10 machine pistol still pointed forward, or rather, a direction. Loud, disembodied voices echoed from the compound like the cries of wounded, confused animals. "Dumb bitches," he muttered. Inside the compound, they worked in silence. Budsworth moved with the certainty of a man who had seen too much to fear anything now, and Cade scrabbled at the shelves and knocked over cans that rolled away into the gloom. The air was close and heavy and smelled of old oil and rats, and Budsworth filled the sacks with what they came for and nothing more. A board creaked somewhere in the dark, and both men froze. Cade's breath caught sharp in his throat, and Bud only listened. The sound of boots. Slow. Sure. Coming closer. He reached out and closed his hand over Cade's wrist and held it tight. "Quiet," he said. Not a whisper, but a word shaped in the empty air between them. He let go and turned back to the sacks, and his shotgun was already in his hand. The boy would learn or he would die. It made no difference to the night. They heard the scrape of a rifle barrel on concrete before they saw them. two shapes, a man and a woman, out of the dark like they had grown there. The man was rangy and hollow-eyed, and a leather jacket sagged from his frame like a shed skin, and the rifle in his hands was near too big for him. His face was poked with old scars, and his beard was a patchy, ragged thing that clung to his jaw like moss on stone. The woman was younger, wild-haired and thin in the way of things that have learned to live on little, and her cheeks were sharp with hunger, and her boots were held together with twine. They both bore the look of creatures who had outlived mercy, faces drawn and hard, and their eyes glinted with that same raw suspicion bred in the bone of all who had learned to kill young and often. The man lifted his gun slow and deliberate, and the woman already had hers shouldered. Cade stood dumb and blinking in the half-light. Budsworth moved. He crossed the space like he'd been poured into it. He caught the woman by the hair and jerked her back against him, his Remington leveled against her throat. She let out a small sound that died quick in her mouth, and the man froze. "Move and I'll kill the bitch," said Bud. His voice was low and made of gravel and death and cold rivers. The woman struggled, but not much, and the man's hands twitched above his rifle. His mouth worked at something to say, but no sound came, and Budsworth's finger curled tighter on the trigger, his eyes flat and empty and seeing nothing that lived. "You go on," he said. "You just turn around and walk. You hear me, boy?" The man did not move. The woman's breath came fast against Bud's arm, and Cade finally found himself and had raised his own gun with shaking hands. The muzzle wavered like a drunkard's path. "I said walk," Bud said again. He pressed the barrel harder against her throat, and she whimpered. The man broke then. He backed away slow, his boots scraping like knives across the floor. He turned and was gone into the black. Bud shoved the woman down hard, and she hit the ground with a grunt, and he kicked her pistol away into the dark. "Get the sacks," Bud said to Cade. His voice was already somewhere else, already on the next problem. Cade nodded and went. The woman lay still and shivering like something small and broken under Bud's eyes, but he was already moving, already sinking back into the dark, where men were only another kind of animal. Talon and Freedom left the bodies cooling in the dust and slipped past the sagging building where the light spilled in ugly seams through the broken boards. Their feet made almost no sound, and they moved in half crouches, and every once in a while a shoulder would brush a wet wall. Their hands were loose at their sides, but never far from the hilt to the stock. Ahead, a shape lurched out of the murk. A man, if he could still be called that. His dreadlocks swung wild as he staggered, and his head was thrown back in mute laughter, and he had a bottle clutched to his chest like a child's toy. His coat was stitched from different eras of failure, patches of denim and canvas, held together by spit and hope, and his boots dragged unevenly, toes catching in the loose gravel. Talon slowed, and Freedom tilted her head, eyes narrowing. They knew he was of no threat. The drunk saw them and grinned, yellow teeth flashing. He raised the bottle in a sloppy salute. "Well, look at this," he slurred, and his voice was wet with liquor and rot, and he swayed back and forth on his heels. "Two little mice crawling across the graveyard." Talon stepped sideways, slow and easy, with his club low against his thigh. "Ain't no mice here," he said. The drunk snorted and wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. His fingers left a black smear on his chin. Then what are you? Freedom's hand drifted to the knife at her belt, fingers flexing once. She smiled without warmth. Hungry. The drunk frowned. The thought slow to catch. His lips moved as if trying to form another word, but Freedom had stepped in close and was quicker than breath. The knife kissed his throat just under the jawline, and the sound was soft, more like a sigh than a death. He dropped the bottle and his arms flapped once like a bird remembering it couldn't fly, and blood sheeted down his chest, hot and black in the dark. His knees gave out and he collapsed in the dirt, twitching once before the stillness took him. Talon stood over the man a moment longer, shifting his weight, feeling the ache of old injuries flare and fade. His fingers drummed once against the haft of his club, a quiet, idle sound like rain on tin. He cocked his head as if listening for something buried deeper in the night. "You're getting faster," he said. Freedom slid her eyes sideways at him and lifted one brow slow and rolled her shoulder once. "You're getting slower." Talon snorted, a dry sound that could have been a laugh if there'd been anything left in him to laugh with, and he toed the body once with the side of his boot, the way you might poke at something half-rotted on the roadside, and the drunk's head lolled wetly, blood pooling on the cracks of the earth like it was seeping back home. "Don't matter," Talon said. His hand rose and he snatched the underside of his beard with the soft rasp of skin on hair. "Dead's dead." Bud knelt slow and his boots grinded against the rubble as he gathered up what the dreadlocks hadn't managed to haul off. The goods were scattered like the bones of small animals. He found a length of coiled copper wire that was green with age, and he found a bundle of crow feathers tied with red twine, and tools wrapped in oiled cloth with their handles worn slick by many hands, and a shortwave radio with a cracked face that buzzed faintly with static, and he found bullets that rolled free across the ground, the shells catching what little white there was and spitting it back cold and colorless. Cade crouched beside him, and his fingers twitched like he meant to say something, but couldn't find the words for it. He picked up a tin flask and shook it near his ear. Nothing. He threw it aside and it rattled away into the dark. Bud held up a knife. The blade nicked and blackened, but still hungry-looking. He turned it once in his hand before sliding it into the sheath at his hip, and then he spoke without looking up. "Could have gone worse." Cade gave a sharp, humorless bark of a laugh. "Could have gone better, too." They worked quiet a while longer, packing what was worth saving into a battered canvas sack, the seams stretched near to breaking. When they finished, Bud stood and wiped his hands on his pants, leaving dark smears across the faded fabric. He looked over at Cade. The boy's mouth set hard, his eyes somewhere far off. "Should have took her first," Bud said. His voice was low. His voice was low, and he dragged the words out slow as if he'd wanted them to hurt. "The woman, she was the fast one." Kate nodded once and kicked at a loose stone with the toe of his boot. "I saw it too late," he said. Bud shifted the strap across his shoulder, and a weight pulled him sideways for a breath before he straightened. He glanced back once at the ruins of the place they'd fought, the ghost of a grim smile touching his mouth. "Don't matter," he said. "Ain't no one gonna carve your mistakes on a stone. You just carry 'em with you." Cabe said nothing. He lifted his own pack and slung it over one shoulder with a grunt and followed Budsworth out into the waiting dark. They moved fast and low, and the night closed around them like a hand. Somewhere ahead, past the black ruins and the fields of old bones and wire, the black tide waited. Jinx paused at the crest of a low ridge, crouched there with his knees popping in the cold, and looked down. Below him, the dreadlocks found their dead. They stumbled into the little clearing where the bodies lay stacked like cordwood, and a woman dropped to her knees with a sound torn from somewhere deep, something raw and animal. And a man kicked at one of the bodies, then staggered back, his mouth moving but no words coming. And another just stood there, shoulders sagging, the lantern in his hand shaking a wild yellow light over the rumen. And Jinx watched them a long moment. Their grief, their anger. He turned his face away. Didn't matter. Not to him. He pulled the collar of his coat higher against the wind and kept walking. The night pressed close and he let his mind drift back. The black tide had found him when he was nothing but bones wrapped in a boy's skin, half dead from the mines, half mad from the dark. They taught him how to cut and steal and kill, and in exchange he gave them what little was left, no questions, no regrets. Sometimes in dreams he still saw their faces, the ones he'd buried, and sometimes he woke with the smell of blood in his mouth, but he did not speak of these things, not to the others, not even to himself. The road bent southward, and in the distance he caught the low murmur of voices, and he slipped into their midst like a shadow joining other shadows. Bud caught sight of him first and gave a small grunt of recognition. Then Cade looked up and nodded. Freedom and Talon sat crouched against a broken fence, passing the canteen back and forth, and Jinx dropped down beside them and folded his boots under him, and they all sat a moment in the silence of survivors. "Got it all?" asked Talon in a rough voice. "Enough," said Bud. He tugged the sack closer and unwrapped a corner, and inside gleamed bits of wire and a rusted revolver and tins of grease and scrap parts and a cracked compass. He smiled without mirth. "They ain't gonna miss it. Not tonight." Freedom wiped her knife clean on the hem of her coat. "They'll be howling for blood come morning." "And our problem," Budsworth said. They talked low and slow, the way old men might at the end of a funeral. The air between them was thick with the scent of blood and old earth and something else beneath it, older still. They walked with their heads low and their hands close to the worn steel at their belts. Cade kicked a stone from the road and watched it skitter off into the dust, and he sighed and said, "We should have seen 'em sooner. They come out of the dark like rats from a flood." Budsworth walked beside him, silent for a time. Then, "You don't see rats when you're staring at the river." Cade nodded like a man who had already been scolded and could find no grounds to argue. And he shifted the sack of stolen goods on his shoulder and kept his eyes ahead. Talon spoke next, voice dry and humorless. "Found one of their dogs drunk near the fence. Could smell the rot on him before we seen them. Said nothing worth hearing. Freed opened his throat like a letter from home." Freedom didn't speak. Her gaze cut through the dark and she tapped the hilt of her blade against her thigh in a slow rhythm, counting heartbeats maybe, or deaths. Cade scratched at the stubble on his chin. "Man didn't even try?" Talon shook his head. "Didn't know he was dead till he hid the dirt." They felt quiet again, the way men do when there ain't much left to say, and saying it would only empty the world a little more. Budsworth adjusted the strap across his chest and said, "We got lucky." Next time luck don't show up, we gotta be faster. Luck ain't never showed up, Talon said. We just get slower dying. Freedom finally spoke, voice low as the wind dragging along the broken fence posts. They ain't gone, not by a long shot. The words hung there, heavy and mean, and they all knew she was right. The dreadlocks would come back looking for blood to pay for blood. They walked a while without speaking, and their shadows were long and bent under the dying stars. In the distance, the road bent toward home, though none of them could see it yet. Budsworth shifted the bag higher on his back and said, almost to himself, "We'd done what we came to do." And the road went on, unwinding itself into the dark.